Hello, my name is Steve Law, and this is the April meeting of the TCCSA, coming to you live from my basement because of COVID-19 this month. And I work for Patterns of Evidence, and this is a company that has put out films on the Exodus in recent years. And we work out of St. Louis Park. Tim Mahoney is the filmmaker, and I've been working in this area for about 17 years now. And today I'm going to be talking about the Red Sea miracle and its importance and some of the different theories for where the Red Sea is and how it might have happened. And I'm going to be walking through that as we look at these slides, and I believe Ryan is going to be punching in on some of these with a full screen so you can see them, because I know you might not see them so great on the screen here. But I'm going to be doing a little bit different approach. Not a different approach, but normally in Patterns of Evidence films, we kind of try to stay in the middle and present the evidence on both sides and kind of let the audience decide. I don't really have time in just over an hour to present multiple different views, so I will be talking about two main views, which is the Egyptian approach and the Hebrew approach to this issue. And I think one of these views has been undersold. It has not gotten the attention it deserves. It's been kind of dismissed and downplayed by a lot of people, and I think it's really a strong case for it. So I'm going to be kind of highlighting that view as we walk through the different ideas on how this all played out. So I hope that you will, by the time we're done, you'll have a greater appreciation for the view that puts the sea crossing at the Gulf of Aqaba, which up until the last few decades has been a basically unknown view. So the question I want to start with is, why does this matter? Does it really matter where the sea crossing happened and how it happened? Or is it just a case of the fact that it happened is the most important thing? And a lot of people I hear that from is, well, it doesn't really matter whether it happened here or there or how it happened. The main thing is that it happened. So does it matter where, and does it matter how? So to begin with, I want to thank Glenn Fritz for providing a lot of these maps I'm going to be using. He's one of the geographers in our film, The Red Sea Miracle. And that film was out, actually part 1 was out this last February. Part 2 was due to be out in May, and obviously that's not happening. We're exploring different options of how we might release that. We could go do a streaming option, or we could wait and put it in theaters later. So that's still up in the air. So we're deciding how to roll out part 2. I also want to thank Ann Benson for providing all the equipment to record this. She provided a camera and lights and everything. It was really great. So without that, I would be stuck. This is really a geographical problem for the question, which sea was crossed? And I have my handy paint stirrer stick I can use for a pointer here. And so the Israelites begin in Egypt, and 40 years later, they end up in the Promised Land. In between that time, they head to a mountain called Mount Sinai, which is disputed. There's several different options. Some people go to the southern Sinai Peninsula, to the traditional Mount Sinai. Others put it in the northern Sinai. Other people put it over here in northern Arabia or central Arabia, or even some quite a ways down here. And you might question, well, isn't Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula? But really, the Sinai Peninsula only received that name of Sinai very late, 1800 years after the Exodus, when Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great, designated Mount Sinai at the traditional site. That's when the Sinai received the name Sinai Peninsula. We have no record of it being called that before that point. So between their departure point in Goshen in Egypt and Mount Sinai, they crossed a sea. And the question is, what sea was that? Where was that? And how deep was it? There's lots of questions about how deep it was. How was it a lake marsh on the borders of Egypt? Was it a deep sea? And we'll be getting into a lot of those questions as we go along. Some of the main bodies of water that have been proposed, really there's only so many options. This is the main body of the Red Sea here, and it has two gulfs in the north. These are over 100 miles long. One is the Gulf of Aqaba over here, and one is the Gulf of Suez, which is on this side, and they create this V-shaped that the Sinai Peninsula is between. And then up here, there's a number of lakes on the border of Egypt that have been proposed, and there's many different particular sites crossed, but we'll be getting into some of those as we go along. I think we're ready for the next slide. If you look in the back of your Bibles or Bible encyclopedias, many of them, when they list all the locations of the Exodus route, will put a question mark after just about every one of those locations. That might be kind of hard to show up here on this screen, but when you see it full screen, hopefully you'll see that Pithom, Mara, Elam, Dafka, these are all campsites of the Exodus. And even Mount Sinai should have a question mark. And then even other sites such as the desert of Paran or the wilderness of Shur or Kadesh Barnea, all of these sites, none of them have been verified with 100% certainty. They're up in the air. People don't know where these are. There's a traditional view, but really there's a lot of questions involved. But since the time of the first century, the traditional view has been that the Israelites came and crossed the northern end of the Gulf of Suez here, and then proceeded down to the traditional Mount Sinai. But since the late 1800s, the predominant view, at least among scholars, has shifted that north up into these lakes up in here. And we'll get into some of the reasons for that in a moment. One of the reasons there's uncertainty is that there are only about 7 verses in the book of Exodus between the time they leave and the time they arrive at the sea. And there's not a whole lot of information there. But you can look in other places of the Bible and find clues, and I think we can, if we really focus on the 7 verses, we can come up with some ideas. Really, there's only 4 places in the whole Exodus journey, or related to the Exodus journey, that we know for sure, and that is the departure point in Ramses or Goshen. We have a good idea where that is. We know where the way of the land of the Philistines was, which was along the coast of the Mediterranean. We know where Edom and Elat were. They were over here on the far side of the Araba Valley over here. And we know where Canaan was, basically. But other than that, pretty much everything has a bit of a question to it. Now I'm going to talk about 2 main approaches to solving the geographic problem of locating the Sea of the Exodus. In the film, we just called them Egyptian and Hebrew. I think it would be nice to kind of flesh those out a little bit. I'll also be calling them the Hebrew narrative approach and the Egyptian toponym approach. And a toponym is just a technical word that means a place name. So the Bible has these place names in it. For instance, the first campsite was at Sukkoth. Well, that's a place name or a toponym. And the Egyptian view tends to have things that are ideas that pull everything close to Egypt. They have the Exodus on a small scale. If they see these toponyms, they give them typically Egyptian definitions. And they also have a more naturalistic view of the miracles involved, typically. So you end up with a smaller Exodus. And they also really focus on these toponyms. That's really, they almost to the exclusion of downplaying some of the other things in the account of them coming out of Egypt. The other view is the Hebrew approach, or the Hebrew narrative approach. I call it the narrative approach because they focus on the full narrative. They take into account the descriptions of the events along the way. They for instance, if the text describes a pillar of cloud and fire going before the Israelites, they see that as a literal pillar of cloud and fire going before them. And if it says they traveled day and night, that comes heavily into their thinking of how the route played out. This view is not Egypt-centric, it's more Canaan-centric. So for example, Edom would seem a long way away to the Egyptian approach because they have an Egypt-centric approach. But for a Canaan-centric approach, Edom is close by. They choose Hebrew definitions for a lot of the terms involved. And they end up with a very big Exodus in comparison. So now there's also scholars that have a combination of these two views. We don't want to pigeonhole everyone. For instance, some people might see the Exodus sea crossing as being far from Egypt and yet not like the idea of spectacular miracles. They want a more naturalistic miracle. Others might pull it closer to Egypt but still like the idea of a spectacular miracle because they think that's what the text is describing. So these are the two basic regions that we're questioning. Was it near Egypt at one of these border lakes or at the very far end of Suez? Or was it far from Egypt at the Gulf of Aqaba? And that's really the basic question. Now, to give a little scale to this, when we look at the size that we're talking about here of the Sinai area, this is West Texas. If you can see the boundary of Texas here, that's the panhandle of Texas, El Paso. And if we overlay that on the Sinai Peninsula, you can see it's just about the size of the panhandle area of Texas. And for those of us in Minnesota, we might relate this to the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. So if you draw a line from International Falls down to a little bit south of Duluth, that would be about the size of the Sinai Peninsula. So it's a large area, but it's not immense. It's pretty manageable. One other point I could bring up is the depth involved. These lakes here on the border of Egypt, most of those are associated with the Nile Delta, so they're shallow. They're less than 10 feet deep. And the Gulf of Aqaba is immensely deep. It goes down, I believe, 5,000 feet in some places. It's part of the Rift Valley of Africa, so it's really deep. So there's a lot of difference between these two views. It's not as though they're close. It's either really deep or really shallow. It's either a far journey to the sea or it's near Egypt. Other questions are for the differences involved, the population size. Typically, the Egyptian toponym view has the Israelites at about 20,000 people. So we're talking tens of thousands. The Hebrew approach would put that number at about 2 million. So it's tens of thousands versus millions. Again, a great contrast. Or the days to the sea crossing. Usually to the border lakes here, the Egyptian toponym view would say it's a few days, 3 days, maybe as much as 7 days. But over here, people are suggesting, no, it could be 2 weeks or 3 weeks or more to the crossing. And it's interesting, the Bible doesn't give the specific number of days to the crossing site. So here we have the border of ancient Egypt is a critical point in this discussion because the ancients considered Egypt the lands watered by the Nile Valley. So everything you see on green here, that's the Nile River Valley and the areas irrigated by the Nile. They had lots of little canals and things. That would be Egypt proper to the Egyptians. So once you get across these border lakes, you're in the desert, you're out of Egypt. Now, Egypt did control territory. It controlled places like mines in the Sinai Peninsula. In the New Kingdom, at least, it controlled a string of forts along the Mediterranean coast. So that was territory controlled by Egypt, but it wasn't Egypt proper. They considered Egypt the lands of the Nile. Another introductory term here is Yam Suf. This is the Hebrew name of the sea that was crossed. And Yam means sea, and Suf is disputed in Hebrew. Most people today would say that means reeds. So it would be Yam Suf, the sea of reeds. And this really has affected the movement of the sea from the Gulf of Suez traditionally since the last 1,500 years or more, bringing it up to those border lakes, the Sea of Reeds, because although there might be a few little coves with a few reeds in them on the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Aqaba, it's really not a reed sea. Those border marsh lakes are really what would be filled with reeds, and so that's one reason why people have pulled that north into that area. So what about the term Red Sea that's in our Bibles? Because, when you open up a modern English Bible, it will usually say Red Sea. Well, that term doesn't enter the Bible until the Greek translation of the Bible, of the Old Testament. That happened perhaps around 250 BC. But they gave the name of Yam Suf. They didn't give it a direct translation. They just inserted a geographic interpretation of Red Sea. And for the Greeks, the Red Sea was a much broader concept than our modern idea of the Red Sea. For the Greeks, there were just two main seas in their thinking. There was the Great Sea, the Northern Sea, the Mediterranean, where Greece was, and then there was the Southern Sea, which was the Red Sea. And that included both arms of the Red Sea, Aqaba and Suez, the main body of the Red Sea, but it also included the entire Indian Ocean and its bays. The Persian Gulf is part of the Red Sea in their concept. Even the Bay of Bengal, all of these areas down here would be thought of as Red Sea. And interestingly enough, the New Testament also uses that term Red Sea twice. So the question is, does Red Sea pertain to marsh lakes in Egypt? And I don't know of any evidence of that. I don't know of any Greek writing that calls these marsh lakes the Red Sea. I think for them the Red Sea was the Southern Ocean in all of its bays. So in that sense, if it was at the Gulf of Aqaba, then the New Testament would not be wrong, because Aqaba is part of the Red Sea in the Greek understanding. However, if it's at a marsh lake, then you begin to question, is the New Testament, did they get it wrong in that sense? In our film, we had 6 steps for the Exodus journey, from their departure in Egypt and out to Mount Sinai, which is just off the screen here. Actually, this is a screen grab from the film. But these are the departure point, the direction, the desert, the detour to a dead end, and then the deep sea, where the sea crossing occurred. And this timing here is actually the Egyptian, more of an Egyptian toponym approach, because you have all of these happening in just the first few days. One question related to when they started to get going. We're starting now with the departure point, or the departure. What were the conditions at the departure? Where did they depart from? One of the big questions is, how many Israelites were there? And the text you see here, it says about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, left. And if you add in the kids, you're going to get around 1 million or more males. And then you have to double that for females. So you end up with about 2 million, maybe 2 to 3 million Israelites. And that is a huge number, and a lot of people have a problem with that number because they just can't conceive of that many people being involved, and they have some reasons to believe that. And it comes down to this term Eleph used. This is a Hebrew term, Eleph. It could be spelled either with a PH or an F. And when it says 600,000, the 1,000 is this word Eleph. So 600 Eleph, or 600,000. And the alternate view would be, well, does it really mean 1,000 in this case? Could it mean a chief, a clan, a unit? In other words, it'd be 600 units or 600 groups. And then they come up with, well, an average unit or squad might be, 6 to 10 men. And so you end up with about 20,000 Israelites total, and much smaller numbers, obviously. The ramifications of population are important, because if there was 2 million, that really determines where the corridors of travel open to you would be. It determines how large a campsite needs to be. It has some ramifications for what kind of a sea crossing is possible. And one reason for taking that 600,000 as actually Eleph, meaning 1,000 rather than unit, is that in Avaris, where the place Ramses or Avaris, the place where the Israelites departed from, that had a population of perhaps 35,000 or more Semites at the time of the Exodus. So there, right alone, just that one settlement had more Israelites than the entire group in the Egyptian toponym approach. So we know there's at least 20 other Semitic settlements in the Nile Delta that haven't even been excavated yet. And so you add that to it, plus all the ones that are out in the fields shepherding their sheep and so forth, and it seems like just archaeologically that alone would indicate larger than 20,000 Israelites. Also, if you think of Lake Timsah, one of the proposed crossing sites in the Egyptian approach, that lake is about 2 miles across, And for 2 million people to camp there, you can see they would actually surround that lake. It would be, crossing through Timsah wouldn't make any sense for 2 million people. But if you're 20,000, then yeah, that might make sense. And that's one of the reasons why the Egyptian approach favors smaller numbers. Here's another big reason why I think the Aleph means 1,000, and it's the census taken of Israel. When you add up all the numbers from the 12 tribes, it comes to 603,550, and the numbers add up perfectly as though the thousands and 100 places were operating normally when you take Aleph as 1,000. But if you take it as units, you come up with 598 units for a total of 5,550 people, and that doesn't match the numbers we see in the text. So the question is, how is Moses doing his math? Here it seems like he's doing his math as we normally would, and here it just doesn't add up. So the blue column, once again, is the chart of what would be considered the Hebrew narrative approach, where the numbers are adding up normally, and there you have Aleph equaling 1,000, which is its normal meaning. And for instance, Reuben is 46 Aleph, or 46,500, not 46 groups equaling 500, as in the Egyptian view. So it's not just the census of the 12 tribes that add up correctly with Aleph as 1,000. When we look at the camp of Israel, Israel had a very organized camp where 3 tribes would camp on each side of the tabernacle, north, south, east, and west, and the tribe of Levi around the tabernacle. And when you add up each of these groups, these subgroups, those numbers are also adding up normally with Aleph as 1,000. And when you take the subtotals, for example, the South Camp subtotal, and add that to the others. The Bible does this explicitly in the text. It adds the 3 tribes to the subtotal, and then it adds the subtotals together, and once again it hits 603,550. So the question is, how is Moses doing his math that these all add up perfectly? And I've yet to see an explanation for how these numbers, there may be an explanation, but I've yet to see it, of how these numbers could be adding up that way, just perfectly as though Aleph equals 1,000. And interesting about the tribe of Levi, it gives some numbers for Levi after the main census, and one is 7,500, for example. Well, that would be 7 groups equaling 500 in the Egyptian view. And now all of a sudden their clans are 70 or 75 people, not 6 to 10, because for 7,500 to be 7 clans equaling 500, all of a sudden now you have a totally different scale for your what Aleph means. And in another place it says the total of Levi was 22,000 even. So that would be 22 clans equaling 0 people in the Egyptian framework, and that just doesn't seem to work. The question comes up is, how can you get then, if there really were over 2 million Israelites, how can you get to that number just during the time in Egypt? There's some question about that. And we can show that you can do that very easily, actually. God had promised Abraham that his family would be multiplied as the stars of heaven. And there's different opinions for how long the Israelites are actually in Egypt. Some think the 430 years that's mentioned is just the time in Egypt, and others think that goes back to the time of Abraham. It's from the promise to Abraham to the Exodus was 430 years. So even if you take the shortest time proposed for being in Egypt at 210 years, when Jacob came into the land, the Bible lists 70 of his offspring that came with him. And if you look at those names, they're all male names. Only 2 of those are females. And the question is, are those important, especially important women that were included in the list to bring it up to the number of 70, a significant number of 70. So regardless, there's 68 males there. Plus we know that his household had many, many more people. Even at the time of Abraham, when he went to rescue Lot, he had 318 men born in his household that went after them. And we know that the household of Abraham and Isaac and then Jacob was growing over time, and when he came back from Haran, he even added to that. So we know there was at least 70 family units potentially there at the beginning of the sojourn in Israel. And if you take a average for each generation a center point of 23 1/3 years. So if they had just as many kids before the age 23 1/3 as after, and you average 3 males per generation, you can get 9 generations in 210 years. And if you multiply by 3 males, after 1 generation you'd have 210 males, then 630. And you see at first it doesn't seem to be growing that fast, but by the time you get to the 9th generation, you have over 1.3 million males. So that is not a outrageous growth rate. Yes, we don't see growth rates like that typically in the world, but God had promised Abraham to multiply his offspring like the stars of heaven, and after they came out of Egypt, that promise was fulfilled. He had done what he had promised. And three males per generation, or 6 kids per generation, is not, especially in the ancient times. I think of my family just 100 years ago, that would have been a small, probably a smaller than average family. A lot of my ancestors, recent ancestors, had 10, 12, 15 kids. So that's not a hard thing to get to that many Israelites. So the question is, had the Bible calls them a great nation when they came out of Egypt, had Abraham's been promised, the promise to Abraham rather, had that been fulfilled? And the question is, would 10,000 males really have fulfilled that over more than 2 centuries? And we see mass groups of people in recent history here, where there's 4 million people that came to see John Paul II on World Youth Day. And here is a Rod Stewart concert, 3.5 million people on one beach for one event. The Kumbh Mela in India is the largest human gathering on earth, and it's a Hindu religious festival on the Ganges River. The numbers there, we're talking 120 to 200 million pilgrims coming over a 50-day period. And here you can see their camps that are spread out over miles. And on the single busiest day, 40 million people. And here we have people that are coming to the same place, the same area. There's certain activities that happen at certain times, so there's some coordination there. And it's 10 to 20 times the size of the Exodus. So it's not as though we haven't seen mass gatherings before. So then the departure point in Egypt, we know that the Bible stresses the fact that they left in an organized and hasty way. Here's an important verse. It says, "The sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt." Other versions say they were equipped for battle. I don't think that the term means equipped for battle. It means they were organized for battle. They were in battle formation or military formation. The number there actually has this meaning of 5 to it. So it's an idea of columns. A left, a right column, a center column, and then a rear guard and a forward unit. So just the way an army moves is the way Israel moved out of Egypt. And we know that Josephus writes about Moses being a general in his early life in Egypt. And certainly the New Testament talks about Moses being great in words and deeds. So he may well have been a general and could have organized that kind of a departure. And they left in haste. We know they ate the Passover with sandals on their feet, ready to go. Here's a couple other verses. It says, the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall be dead." And the bread was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait. So we have them leaving in haste. And then we know the departure point is, this might not show up well on your map, but the site of Avaris or Ramses. It was known as Avaris earlier in its history, Ramses later in its history, in the Goshen area near the Mediterranean. So now we're on to the next step, the second step, which is direction. I'm not going to spend as much time on this one. You can see it in our film. We have more time spent for this. But a couple main points. One is that when they left, they went on a way that was not the way of the land of the Philistines. Now, the way of the Philistines is this yellow line. It was the main route out of Egypt along the coast. That's the way the armies went when they were attacking the Hittite kingdom and Syria. And there's really only 2 or 3 main routes out of Egypt. We have these roads on the map here, you can see. And the Bible says explicitly that they did not take that northern route. Yet this is where a lot of these lakes up in the north end of the border area here are where a lot of people put the Exodus, and some of them are right on that road, within a few hundred meters of that road. So it just doesn't seem to work that the Bible says they didn't go there, and then they have their crossing in the same spot. What the Bible does say is that they went on the way of the wilderness of Yam Suf. And ways in the Bible are named for their destination. So this is, you could either say the wilderness road to Yam Suf or the way toward the wilderness of Yam Suf. So one of the other main routes, a main caravan route that went east out of Egypt, is this yellow line that went above the 2 heads of the Red Sea, the 2 gulfs, from Suez to Aqaba, and that I think is the best candidate for the way of the wilderness of Yam Suf. One interesting thing is that they ended up going on a detour eventually, and they still ended up at Yam Suf. So this shows that Yam Suf is a large body of water, not a small lake. The next step is desert. Desert is, we chose the name desert because all of our steps start with a D, but as we'll see, that might not be the best name for it. The definition of the word in the Bible for wilderness is midbar, and that doesn't always mean a desert. No doubt some of the lands the Israelites crossed were dry desert areas, but not necessarily all of them. There could have been large areas that were pasture land or grassland, and we see that there's some latitude to this term midbar, which means wilderness in the desert. And here's one example that when Joseph went to find his brothers and they threw him into the well, Reuben says not to shed his blood, but to throw him in this pit in the wilderness where they're at. And where they were at was the town of Dothan, way up here, halfway between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So this is a fairly moist area. There's good grassland up there. So he's basically saying that they were in a wilderness, or they were in the middle of nowhere. In other words, there was no towns around, no support for people. They were, just open, empty land. But it doesn't necessarily mean a desert. And there are some indications that the Sinai region had wetter periods in the past, and certainly during the time of the Exodus, there appears to be be one of those wetter periods. There is also an indication that a substantial wilderness was crossed before the sea crossing. We know that Pharaoh, when he talked about the Israelites, said that the people of Israel are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. So there's an idea that before the sea crossing, they are in a wilderness, and it's a wilderness large enough where they could be lost, and rough enough that it could shut them in. Another indication might be this verse in Judges that says, when Israel came from Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and came to Kadesh. So that would also perhaps indicate that there was a substantial sea crossed before the sea crossing. So the question becomes, well, which wilderness was it? In the Egyptian toponym view, the wilderness crossed the only sandy place between these border lakes, at least the northern ones, and their departure point is this little sandy patch here of desert area, but it's only about, you could cross it in about 12 miles. And when you think of the group of Israelites, obviously if there was over 2 million Israelites, they would have stretched from one end of that desert to the other. So the idea of becoming lost in that wilderness doesn't quite fit. It doesn't really fit as a substantial place where that shut them in. It's relatively flat. Of course, the whole Nile Delta is completely flat. The other option is if they're going to Aqaba, they could have crossed the Sinai Peninsula to get there, which would be the wilderness. And this is 150 miles from the north end of Suez here to the north end of Aqaba over here. So 150 miles is not immense. It's not, like we're looking at Africa here, or South America. It's 150 miles, which you could drive across in 2 hours. You could walk across it certainly in 2 weeks or a week to 2 weeks. Now, God commanded Moses to make a list of the camps in Numbers 33, the book of Numbers. And he listed there out the camps, and they're listed on the wall here, and just on the edge, you can't see, but Mount Sinai, I believe, is Camp 11. And so it was 3 camps to the sea crossing. Camp 1 of Sukkoth, Camp 2 of Etham, and Camp 3 was at the sea, at Yam Suf. And the Bible doesn't give a specific number of days to the crossing, but some people postulate that, well, because it's 3 camps to the crossing, then it's a travel and a camp at night, and a travel and a camp at night, and a travel and a camp at night. So they say, 3 camps, 3 days to the sea crossing. But, as we'll see in a bit here, that's not quite that simple. And to really know which of those wildernesses is the right one, you have to know, A, how many days was it to the sea crossing, and B, how much distance could they cover per day, the rate. Now, when we look at ancient records, we see that an average day of travel is generally around 20 miles a day. And there's a range of 18 to 22 miles. There's been studies done on this. And when the ancients recorded a day's travel, depending on obviously the terrain and so forth, that they're talking about 20 miles a day, and that's normal travel conditions, not necessarily pushing the pace or grazing sheep, but just a normal traveling pace. Armies could probably go a little bit slower because they had gear, siege machinery, and so forth. They had to bring supplies. But armies, we have one example, I believe Alexander the Great, his army at one point went 45 miles in a day, but that was with great purpose, under great need. We think about the Oregon Trail. There it was average of about 15 miles a day, but they were going over mountain ranges and rivers and in covered wagons. Many of them had lots of possessions with them, chests and things. And actually another route to Oregon was opened up by the Hudson Bay Company from York Factory to Hudson Bay. It was longer, but it was quicker. It was 2,600 miles, and they did it in 100 days. So that was 26 miles a day average because it was through easier terrain. And just to give you an idea of the limits of human capabilities, they have these ultra marathon races, and some of them they supply the rest stops every so often with food and drink. Others you have to carry it on your back, and a lot of them there's maybe 20 miles between stations. So you can see here there's a Sahara race, and you can see all the people with packs and water bottles strapped to them. And when we look at the records covered for a 24-hour period, we see the record for men is 188 miles in one day, and for women 162 miles in one day. And the 100-mile record is just over 11 hours. So we're not talking anything like that for the Exodus journey, but it's not even half of that, not even 1/4 of that distance would be a rate that I think could be achieved. And it's nowhere near what humans are capable. Obviously, the Israelites were not trained distance runners, but they were fit. And so the idea that they could only go very short distances is questionable. Another question comes up, what about the sheep? Would the sheep have slowed them down? Some have said, well, maybe they could only go 6 miles a day because you have to feed the sheep. Well, these are Awasi sheep. They're a Middle Eastern sheep, and they are an ancient breed that originated in the Syria area. And we know that today in Israel, that's the type of sheep that are common. And they're a fat-tailed sheep that is uniquely adapted to the desert environments. They have special ways of cooling their skin with an air layer between their skin and their fur. They can get all the moisture they need just from eating plants at many times of the year. And so they would be uniquely adapted to traveling long distances, just eating as they go, but not necessarily having to graze. And remember, the Exodus was not them grazing their sheep. They had a destination and they were driving to it. We have accounts from the British Agricultural Department of Bedouin flocks in Iraq actually being herded, Awasi sheep being herded to their market, where they averaged 22 miles a day over several days. So we have documentation of that. Another question is, well, what about the kids? The kids are going to slow you down. Well, this is a mural from Beni Hassan. You can see here a group of Semitic travelers coming to Egypt, and they have their equipment with them. But if you zoom in on one of the donkeys, you can see two kids that are packed up on the donkey. And then we read in the book of Exodus that when Moses took his wife and sons on his way to Egypt, he had them ride on a donkey, and he went back to the land of Egypt. So the ancient people knew how to travel. The kids didn't slow them down. They packed them up with everything else. And then a final challenge might be, well, what about the water? This is a very dry section, at least today it's extremely dry. And it's sandstone, it doesn't retain water long, even if the water did fall. But we know that, that the trek down to the traditional Mount Sinai goes through some very dry areas too, that are very similarly dry as this, just after the crossing instead of before it. And we have accounts of things called desert blooms. This is a super bloom from the southwest U.S. in 2019. And you can see this was desert. This is normally pure desert. And it's just covered with foliage because of unusually heavy spring rains. And normally in the spring is when the desert gets most of its water. And this is the area in Southern California. This is Death Valley, actually, where a 10-mile lake formed when they got just a couple inches of rain in the mountains. And it shows that rain can pool up. And you see the verse here, God provided rain during the Exodus. It says in Psalms, rain in abundance, O God, you shed abroad, you restored your inheritance as it languished. So there's the idea that God could provide water. And remember that Death Valley is one of the hottest and driest places on the face of the earth. So for a 10-mile lake to form there is quite unusual, but it does happen, and it's quite incredible. So we think of God's supernatural care, that we don't necessarily have to limit our options to those routes that are the best watered that we see today. God could have provided for his people, and the text does say he provided. For instance, there's verses talking about their sandals not wearing out, traveling day and night behind a pillar of fire. And with that pillar, we know that if they were traveling day and night, that this was hasty travel. They were covering a lot of ground. So we have a departure that was hasty. We have travel that is hasty. And I think it's hasty all the way to Mount Sinai, because when we get to Mount Sinai, we have God making the statement that he had brought them out on eagle's wings to come to himself at the mountain. And when we look at other verses that talk about eagle's wings, one example is in Isaiah 40, where it says, but they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And that, I think, could be hearkening back to the Exodus even. We have this instance in the Bible of Jacob fleeing from Laban. And this is really a good example of what kind of distances could be covered if there was great need. And we have Jacob in Haran, which is up in this area, modern-day Turkey. And they flee from Laban, and they travel a distance of 350 miles to the hills of Gilead, where Laban finally catches them. And they say that Laban caught Jacob on the 10th day. So in less than 10 days, they covered 350 miles. That's 35 miles a day. And this was kind of a mini Exodus, a pre-Exodus. You see some of these themes repeated in the Bible, like women at the well or going down to Egypt. Well, here's another one. Jacob fleeing, whose name is Israel, fleeing from a tyrant. And who did he have with him? He had his wives, their children, large flocks and herds. And they covered a distance of over 35 miles a day for 10 days straight. So that tells you what is possible. Now, we don't know how many days it took to the sea crossing, specifically in the Bible, but we do have an important chronological date, and that is the yellow date here. It's the first specific time given. We know there was 3 days travel after the crossing, but we don't know the total. But we do know it was a total of 30 days to enter the wilderness of sin. Now, this happened after Camp 6 on that list that Moses made. And so the question is, if it's 1 month to enter the wilderness of sin just after Camp 6, would it not be about half that time for something that happened at Camp 3, which was the sea crossing? So that would put the sea crossing at about half a month or 2 weeks of travel. And you can travel quite a way in 2 weeks, obviously. We know there's multiple days between camps because here we have 6 camps in 30 days. So it's not 1 day per camp. It's multiple days per camp. And they may have been camping 2 days at each camp. In fact, there's a verse in the Bible that indicates that. And there are several places where it says it's 3 days travel. It's not just the 3 days in the wilderness. So you have this idea of multiple days of traveling. They might have been eating and resting on the way, maybe short periods of sleep, but they didn't set up camp except for these major camps that are mentioned. And so some people actually take the opposite approach. They say, well, it's 30 days to Camp 6. Well, 1 day back to Camp 6, 1 day back to Camp 5, to Camp 4, 3 days travel. So they put the crossing at 24 days, actually. But I think the average, the mean, would be to put the sea crossing at about half the time, because Camp 3, half a month, Camp 6, 1 month. That seems to be the average. The further you get from that point, the more explanation, I think, is required. There's even some indication that they might have come out of Egypt on the very first day. We have this verse, for example, and on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. So on that very day, they came out of Egypt. And when you think about if we were taking a trip out west, a road trip, and if we said we were out of Minnesota on the first day, we wouldn't say that if we had stayed in a hotel in Albert Lea. We would still be in Minnesota. We wouldn't say we were out of Minnesota on the first day if we were still in Minnesota. Or if we're flying to Europe and our plane got stuck in New York, we wouldn't say we were out of America on the first day. We'd have to wait till we were actually out. Now, you could maybe argue that day here doesn't mean a 24-hour period. It means, an unspecified amount of time. But I think there's a pretty good indication here that they were out of Egypt, which means, remember, this green here is the cultivated. This is a satellite map. So the edge of this green is the edge of Egypt. And if they were out of that, it's only maybe 25 miles from Avaris or Ramses to the edge of Egypt there. So there's no question that at least the leading companies could easily have gotten past that point on the first day, which means the first camp of Sukkoth, which everyone likes to put here in the Wadi Tumlat, it could have been out in the desert somewhere. We don't know, because it just means the booths or the camp. And so that camp could have been just about anywhere. So which wilderness was it? Here's a quote by Philo, which seems to match what the Bible is saying pretty well. He says, "Having accomplished together a long and desolate journey through the wilderness, destitute of any beaten road, at last they arrived at the sea, which is called the Red Sea." So we know they took a detour off the road, and that certainly would have been a trackless wilderness if Aqaba was indeed the crossing site. It's hard to have that same thought when we're just crossing this little 12-mile sandy patch here on the edge of the Nile Delta. So now we're ready for the next step, the detour to the dead end. Once again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. There's much more time spent in the film if you want to see more details on this. But there's a key verse here for the turning point. The text says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdal and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea." So here we have a set of toponyms or place names that any account of the Exodus needs to deal with. And here are the terms, and here are the meanings given to those terms. So Pi-hahiroth means either the mouth of the gorge, that's the Hebrew view, or the mouth of the canals, which would be more of an Egyptian toponym approach, because that's the Akkadian meaning for Ha-hiroth. Migdal means tower or fortress, and Yam Suf is the sea that was crossed, and that, remember, Suf there is thought to be reeds, but that's disputed. And Baal-Zephon means Lord of the North, and the thinking there is, does that mean a place of worship for the god Baal? And the Egyptian view actually has come up with some pretty interesting proposals for the connections of these Egyptian places and these terms. And the question is, are those as strong as they claim? When we look at the Hebrew approach, there was only one way that led from that main road that went from the Gulf of Suez to the Gulf of Aqaba, which we think is the way of the wilderness of Yam Suf. There was only one route through the mountains that led to the sea, and that's this place called the Wadi Watir. And it's a cavernous, narrow canyon with high mountains on every side that leads to this enormous beach on the sea. And it's really an interesting, distinct feature. And we have this quote, we know that Pharaoh quoting Pharaoh from the Bible, he says, they're wandering in the wilderness, that are shut in. And we have this quote from Josephus that says, now when the Egyptians had overtaken the Hebrews, they also seized on the passages by which they imagined the Hebrews might fly, shutting them up between inaccessible precipices and the sea, for there was on each side a ridge of mountains that terminated at the sea, which were impassable by reason of their roughness and obstructed their flight. So, we can't count on everything that Josephus writes as being perfectly accurate, but here his description seems to match that of Pharaoh's pretty well. And remember that at the border lakes, most of those are on the Nile Delta, and it's completely flat. There's no mountains of any kind. Hard to see how the wilderness would shut them in. The Nuweiba Beach here is also very unique. It's about 8 square miles. Plenty of room for millions of Israelites to camp. And if you look at the entire coastline here, you see it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, this Nuweiba Beach. It's about halfway down the Gulf. Now, we don't know for sure that a crossing might have happened at Nuweiba Beach, but it just seems to be something that's lining up rather well. It's off the main road of Midian, and it's the only way through the mountains to the sea. So it seems tailor-made. Another interesting comment is Pi-hahiroth could mean the mouth of the gorges. And here you see the mouth of Wadi Watir, the gorges coming out onto the beach. And when you think of the pillar of fire in the account has the pillar of fire going from before the Israelites back behind them to separate the Egyptians and the Israelites all night. And at all the other crossing sites, you wonder, well, how could a pillar do that? Maybe if it made a curved wall miles wide, it could do that, but a pillar would seem hard to separate an army from millions of Israelites. But here you have this unique feature where the gorges come out onto the beach, where a pillar could easily block this canyon and keep the Egyptians away from the Israelites. It's a very interesting, unique feature. Now, as I said, the Egyptian toponym approach has a lot of places fitting those 4 terms, such as Migdal and Pi-hahiroth. They have an actual tower named after Seti I, called Migdal on an Egyptian inscription. They have Pi-hahiroth as mouth of the canals. Well, we know there was a canal system up here that was included in their defensive forts and so forth that kept Asiatics out of Egypt, or controlled their passage anyway. And some of these toponyms, however, are dependent on a New Kingdom exodus. For example, we know there was this line of forts along here, and most of those perhaps were a New Kingdom reality that weren't there in the earlier Middle Kingdom, when the Exodus, we think, might have happened in an earlier period. Another problem is this Migdal here. This is Bala Lake. This is one of the northern lakes that are proposed as a sea crossing. And the Israelites, they have camping here and then crossing the Bala Lake near this canal. But the Bible says that the Israelites were to camp between Migdal and the sea. So you'd expect that Migdal should be behind them and the sea in front of them. But in this setup here, Migdal is not behind them. In fact, it's miles and miles away on a completely different body of water. They're not between Migdal and the sea. And so it doesn't really fit the history in some cases. For example, Baal Zephon here, there was a temple here, but it wasn't known to existed until long after the New Kingdom even. So it doesn't fit history, it doesn't fit the logistics of how the Bible describes, such as between Migdal and the sea. It just doesn't isn't quite as strong as advertised, I think. Another interesting point is the Nile Delta is actually building out. This shaded green here today is the Lake Manzala area. Some people have proposed a crossing through that. But the edge of the delta, the coastline here, is actually about 25 miles further out now than it was at the time of the Exodus, and perhaps even more. So the maps in your Bibles that show a modern coastline and then just stick names on it, those aren't right, because the Nile Delta was not nearly as extensive as it was, or is much more extensive today than it was back at the time of the Exodus. And so the question is, did some of these border lakes even exist? For example, the Bitter Lakes is a popular spot. And if we go to this slide, we can see the Bitter Lakes here. There's some evidence that might not have even existed at the time of the Exodus, because Greek explorers that went in this area just described a desert land there. They don't describe a big lake. We know at the time the Suez Canal was built, this was dry. It was a dry salt pan, maybe marshy. At times when the Nile had very high floods, maybe some of the water could have gotten into there. But it only became a lake when the Suez Canal connected to it, and billions of gallons of seawater flowed into it, and it took months and months to fill it up. And we have accounts of that happening. So it may be that some of these lakes didn't even exist. And then the fact that some people, propose here, some here, some here, some here, some here. Each one puts a Migdal at their location because the Bible demands it. They're supposed to camp between Migdal and the sea. So the influence of Egyptology, that it has to be near Egypt, is called into question because the different sites proposed along the border of Egypt each employ a different set of toponyms. And so that really calls into question the strength of the claim that these toponyms are so clear that they demand a near Egypt crossing location for Yam Suf. Here's one more point, the death cry of the Israelites. At the sea crossing, the Israelites cry out to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in a wilderness? What have you done in bringing us out of Egypt?" So from this verse, we see two key points. They're in a wilderness, they're out of Egypt. Neither of those would have been the situation at, for example, the northern border lakes like Bala Lake. They would have been right on the main highway in Egypt. They would have been in a grassland, in a reed-filled area. They weren't out in the middle of nowhere. They weren't. They were still in Egypt there. They were not out of Egypt. But that fits perfectly over here at Aqaba. You're heavily mountainous, no cities that we know of. There was just nothing there. I should mention too, there's two other sites proposed for a crossing at Aqaba. Some have proposed this site down here at the south end. It's also extremely deep. And others that if people want a shallow water crossing, some have proposed through a swampy area at the far north end of Aqaba. We'll get to some of those ideas in a bit. Okay, on to the next step, the deep sea. This is the final step. This is kind of where the rubber hits the road. Some people might protest right out of the gate, well, was it really a deep sea? Was it actually deep? And here are some verses and some of the terms that have been used for the description of the sea crossing. Strength, deep, mighty, deeps, mighty depths, great depths, roaring. For example, in the Song of the Sea, it says, the Egyptians went down into the depths like a stone. And this word deep here, it means the same as the abyss. So it means very deep. And it has to be large enough to drown the entire Egyptian army. It also has to be long enough for a second camp at Yam Suf. They cross the Red Sea, and then the Bible says 3 campsites later, they actually camp on the shore of the Red Sea again. So Yam Suf has to be long enough to accommodate many days of travel, has to be mighty, big, deep. Those don't seem to fit the border lakes. So a key verse that talks about the location of Yam Suf is this. Here's a couple. I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. So that's marking the borders, kind of the ideal borders of the Promised Land, from the Euphrates down to the wilderness, and then from Yam Suf, or the Red Sea, to the Sea of the Philistines, or the Mediterranean. That can only mean Aqaba. You're not going to have the border of Israel anywhere here. Nowhere in history have we known of a border or anything like that. And so that clearly puts Yam Suf at the Gulf of Aqaba. Another example would be King Solomon built his ships, a fleet of ships. He put them in port on the Gulf of Aqaba, which the text says at Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. We know that is over here near Edzon Geber. And we know that Yam Suf is also the sea of the Exodus, because Pharaoh's chariots and his host were sunk in the Yam Suf, it says in Exodus 15. So here you have Yam Suf clearly being associated with the Gulf of Aqaba. And the interesting thing is that the term Yam Suf is used 24 times in the Bible. And of those 24 times, 7 have clear geographical references connected to the verse. And in every one of those 7, it's talking about places like Canaan, which is green here, and Edom, which we know had to be east of Canaan, and places in Edom. And we just saw the one about the border of the Promised Land and Solomon having his ships here. All 7 of the verses where we know where it's talking about all put it at Aqaba. There are no verses that put it anywhere else. Now you will often see in commentaries and so forth, they'll say, well, here's the verses that put it at Aqaba. Other verses put it at Suez, other verses put it at the border lakes. But then when you look at those verses carefully, the ones that are claimed for Suez or the border lakes, there's nothing in those verses that tell you where it is. Those are just based on the assumption of, oh, if it's talking about the sea crossing, then it must be over here. So it's kind of circular reasoning that they're using to get those lists. So they sidestep this issue, those in the Egyptian toponym view, by either saying, well, everything was Yam Suf, or by shifting places further west toward Egypt to make it fit better with a border lakes crossing. Here's one example of a shifting toponym, and this has to do with the wilderness of Shur. Now, if you're in Aqaba, you're going to put the wilderness of Shur over here somewhere, but the Egyptian view, you can see most maps, you can check in the back of your Bible, it says here, wilderness of Shur, right up against Egypt. And the reason that's done is because their sea crossing is on the border lakes, and it says after they crossed the sea, they entered the wilderness of Shur. So if you have a sea crossing here, you need a Shur here. If you have a sea crossing over here, you need a Shur over here. And that's the issue that's in play here. And it's not just the wilderness of Shur. You know, all the terms associated with the Exodus have this same issue, that whether you're talking places like Edom or Midian or Paran or the wilderness of Sin, Yam Suf, or the location of Mount Sinai, if you're over here with your crossing place, then that suggests these places are in the Sinai. But if this is your crossing in Aqaba, then these places have to be associated over here. So it just depends on which view you have, where you put these places. The question is which set of locations, is it here or there, best fits what's in the Bible. And this issue of Shur is typically brought up as kind of a trump card to say, well, it has to be, the sea crossing has to be right near Egypt because that's where the wilderness of Shur is. But is the wilderness of Shur really there? Shur means wall. So those in the Egyptian toponym view will say, oh, we know there's a place called the Walls of the Ruler, which is a defensive system of forts and canals and things that are along the northeast delta, where the sea crossing location would be. So the wilderness of Shur being associated, that seems to make sense in that view. Glenn Fritz, on the other hand, says that Moses, when he's talking about toponyms, is using very big, large-scale locations. He's out in the wilderness. For example, at the sea crossing, it says between Migdal and the sea. He would say, well, Migdal is the mountains here, and they're camping between Migdal and the sea. So between the towering mountains and the sea would be his explanation. So Shur he puts as this wall of mountains, which was the edge of the land of Edom, that rise out of the Araba Valley, which goes from the Dead Sea down to Aqaba here. And that this wall of mountains is the Shur, the wall being spoken of, and the wilderness of Shur would be associated with that over here. And this verse is often brought up to say, well, no, it must be right adjacent to Egypt, because the verse says, they, who is the sons of Ishmael, settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite, or Panaim, Egypt, in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. So this term here for opposite, this Panaim, or Panim, I guess it's pronounced, they interpret this as meaning adjacent to, or right up against. And the literal meaning is on the face of. But the question is, does this term Panim have a broader meaning than that? Because it says some of the meanings are adjacent, that's definitely one of the meanings, but it can mean just east of, which wouldn't really indicate how close it is, or on the face of, or opposite of. And I think the meaning of this term might depend on the scale of the verse being spoken of. For instance, we know at the tabernacle, the singers at the tabernacle were said to be using this same word, panim, in front of the tabernacle, adjacent to, or right in front of, or opposite of, or on the face of the tabernacle. And obviously tabernacle singers are going to be very close to the tabernacle. That would be adjacent to, that would be right up against the tabernacle. But then when we get to Mount Nebo, it is said to be opposite of, or on the face of, Jericho. So in that case, opposite of, or on the face of, would be about 10 miles distance, and we're talking about the Jordan Valley there. But in this verse, it sets up a very large scale. It says, in the direction, it's Panim, Egypt, in the direction of Assyria. So here's Egypt in yellow, and Assyria is the green area up here. And so the different distance between the capital of Memphis here in Egypt and Assur in Assyria, that's a distance of about 800 miles. So that's setting up a very large scale. And about 1/4 of that distance, on a direct line between the two, is this wall of mountains that would have impeded any traffic there, that Glenn Fritz says, no, that's sure. And it seems that would fit this verse of being east of, or opposite of, on the face of Egypt. In other words, in the direction of Assyria, eastward, but nearer to Egypt. It's about 1/4 of the distance is where you hit this wall. So I think the scale allows this to be further away than just immediately adjacent to. And beyond that, this verse talks about the sons of Ishmael settling from Havilah to Shur. And we know that Havilah was east of the promised land, and Ishmael is actually associated with Midian. And we know that Abraham sent all of his sons east of Isaac, to the east country, east of Canaan. And if we look at a map, Canaan is here in the green. This area is east of Canaan, but the Sinai Peninsula is west of Canaan. So all that fits for Midian being over here, that fits for Ishmael being over here. So he's settled from Havilah to Shur, both of which need to be east of Canaan. So Shur in this verse actually fits Aqaba better than the border lakes. Other people bring up David and Solomon. Once again, their military activity was in Canaan. It wasn't way over here, 150 miles away on the border of Egypt. There's talk of Hagar traveling on the way to Shur with Ishmael. They say, well, she's going back to Egypt. Well, was she? We don't know that for sure. Would an Egyptian slave necessarily be going back to Egypt? And we know that Ishmael ended up settling over here, not over by Egypt. So there's nothing that compels Shur to be on the border of Egypt, and there are several indications that it wasn't. It had to be, in some cases, over here. So Ashur near Aqaba actually fits better. Okay, what about the definition of Suf? So much has been made about Yam Suf, means Sea of Reeds. That must mean these border marsh lakes that were filled with reeds. But does Suf really mean reeds? When we look at the family of Suf-like words in the Bible, and I'm no Bible or no Hebrew expert, but I just looked at the Strongs here. This is from Glenn Fritz actually, but if you just look in the Strongs, you can find it for yourself. These are the Strong's numbers for these Hebrew terms. And normally in Hebrew, the name of a noun is taken from a root verb. And so there's a close association there. But the thing that complicates matters is that that's not always the case. Sometimes you can have a word where you don't really see the obvious connection between the meaning of the root verb and the word that actually comes from it. So we have to delve in a little deeper to see how suf is used in the Bible, because the root verb here is associated with the word end, coming to an end, a termination, a limit. And so the question is, what does suf mean? Now, suf in the Bible normally is used just as in the term yam suf. That's 24 times. That's where it's given the word definition red in most Bibles. We know that's not a direct translation. That's a geographic interpretation. So these red columns here, red lines, are the Red Sea verses. And then we have this green, which is where it's interpreted as reeds. And that only happens 4 times in the Bible, where suf is used on its own as a noun apart from Yam Suf or Red Sea. So those are really the key verses to determine the meaning of suf. All these other black lines here are all suf-related words that aren't suf itself. There's sof and sufa and safa and the verb suf. So the question is, what does suf mean in these 4 places where it's used on its own apart from Yam Suf? And when we look in the Bible, the key one is where Moses is put into the suf of the Nile. It's used twice here. And people say, well, Moses' mother put the child in a basket and placed it among the reeds or the suf by the riverbank. And they say there, suf must mean reeds. And here again, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman to get it. That's the Egyptian princess. Now, the interesting thing is, the basket itself was not made of reeds. There's a different word there. It's made of bulrushes, and using this term. And so the basket was made of reeds or papyrus, and yet it was put in the suf, which is a different word, by the riverbank. And this seems to fit the idea of end very well. It's the end of the water, the edge of the water, on the riverbank. And so it could go either way there. I mean, there could have been reeds there, but the word itself doesn't necessarily need to have a vegetation meaning. It could be she made the basket out of bulrushes or papyrus and put it at the edge or the end of the water on the riverbank. Another example is Jonah at the bottom of the sea. Jonah is said to, when he was thrown overboard and sank into the depths of the sea, it says, when he's near the bottom of the sea, he says a prayer actually while in the belly of the fish that says, "The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds," or suf, were wrapped around my head. So the question is, does suf there mean weeds? Some people would say, well, it means, in this case, obviously seaweed related to weeds or reeds. And the question is, does that really have to mean reeds? Because when you look at the Mediterranean Sea, I was kind of surprised when I looked this up. The average depth of the Mediterranean is around 4,900 feet, so it's an exceedingly deep sea. The maximum depth is over 17,000 feet deep. And this fits the verse that says that he was in the deeps, where it says the deep surrounded me here. That word is the same as the word for abyss. It's the same word used in creation. It's a very deep body of water. And so if he's in the Mediterranean, all he'd have to be is in the average depth to be at, over 4,000 feet deep. The problem is seaweed does not grow in the deeps. It only grows in the shallows. It only grows in the first 30 or 40 feet of the ocean, where it's shallow, depending on how much light gets through. But you don't find seaweed in the depths. That's actually the last place this is what the deeps look like. You would not expect to find any kind of vegetation down there. And if it's thousands of feet deep, it's completely dark and there's no seaweed. And so seaweed doesn't actually fit this verse at all. It does fit the idea, though, of the end or the bottom of the sea. Once again, that suf-related meaning of end or termination or limit, boundary. And we know that for the boundary of the promised land, that Yam Suf, Sea of the End, would fit very well there as well. So it seems to be a strong case that Yam Suf doesn't have to mean Sea of Reeds. It could very well mean Sea of the End. But of course, the greatest thing we're looking at is where it is, not necessarily what it means. And we know that of the times the Bible references Yam Suf, every time there's a geographic meaning, it's always Aqaba. And so what is the crossing like at Nuweiba Beach? It's actually very deep, but we'll get into that here in a second. It's 9.6 miles across from the current Egyptian side to the current Saudi Arabia side. And we know that in the middle it gets actually very deep. You see these two very deep areas north and south, but the unique thing is here, although it gets deep in the middle, there's a unique saddle that forms here that has a very gentle slope. The issue for a lot of people, though, is at the middle. By the time you get to the middle, it's 850 meters deep. And that, of course, is beyond explanation for anything but the power of God to split a body of water like that. But the reality is, if the water was removed, we have a crossing point here where you could walk it because the slopes are very gentle. This is one of the normal Aqaba sections where you have a steep drop off here, another steep drop off here, and then a very steep climb to the other side. This is very gradual. The average slope here is less than 12%, or about 7 degrees. And there are a few slightly steeper sections, but they're certainly no different than the type of terrain they had already traveled on to get to the Gulf. The problem is, of course, this 850 meter deep middle. Now the border lakes, those are all less than 10 feet deep. In fact, to get the wind set-down effect where they have the naturalistic idea of wind blowing at 60 or 70 miles an hour for hours, that gradually pushes the water off of the lake bed so that the Israelites could cross. The limit on the depth of that happening is about 6 to 7 feet. Any deeper than that, and you can't really get the water to remove. And so the question is, was this a naturalistic miracle? Was this normal east wind blowing that caused a shallow sea to part? Or was it a tremendously deep crossing that destroyed Pharaoh's army? A lot of people have dismissed this idea, not only for the miracle aspect. Some people are okay with spectacular miracles, but still really are against this option of an Aqaba, the deep water Aqaba crossing. And that is because some of the sensational claims that have been made of chariot wheels and chariot parts and other things that have claimed to have been found at the bottom. Question is, have any of that been found? And I can't really speak to that because nothing has been brought up that can be examined or verified or looked at scientifically. So it remains a tantalizing possibility. But really, I think the major point is that an Aqaba crossing, even at Nuweiba Beach, does not rely on finding evidence there. Because even if we didn't find any of it, even if none of those finds had been verified, it wouldn't put this site at a disadvantage to any of the other sites because nowhere else has any verified archaeological evidence either. And I find it curious, though, that this is the only place where people are looking. They're not really even looking for evidence that I know of in the Border Lakes area. This brings up the kind of the crux of the issue, the east wind and the walls of water. Because a lot of people say, well, okay, I'm okay with spectacular miracles, but the text explicitly says that it was the east wind that parted the water. It says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And that phrasing there of God using the east wind in this event causes them to say, well, if the east wind is what God used to do it, then we have to look for a body of water, such as this border lake here, that a east wind is capable of parting. And some people will say, the verses that make it a deep sea, those are all poetic verses, and so we can't really rely on those historically. But really, poetry can be used to communicate true history or false history, just like someone's narrative. A historical account can be false, it can be fiction, or it can be true. So there's really no distinction. The Bible often uses poetry right after a narrative section to say the exact same story. The one account will be in the history and one account will be in the poetry, and they're telling the same exact story. One is just in a poetic style, one is in a historical narrative style. So poetry doesn't really mean fiction or nonfiction. It's just a different way of telling about an account. But if you take a shallow water crossing, then it really seems to be setting up a contradiction between the verses that describe this as a deep and mighty sea. And then there's also the issue of walls of water. In Exodus 15, it says the waters were piled up and they stood up in a heap. And how do you get waters to stand up in a heap with just a normal east wind? That a wind set down doesn't really fit with that. And when you look at this verse, it says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And we know that God had given Moses his staff as an instrument to perform these miracles. And so if you say, well, it mentions the east wind, so it has to be an east wind explainable event, you could also apply that same thing to the staff. Do we have to look for a sea that only a staff is capable of splitting? And obviously, there's more going on here than just the staff or just the wind. The question is, was God in the wind? God working through the staff to perform a miracle that was beyond what would normally happen. And I think there's an important theological angle here that is often under-addressed by the Egyptian toponym approach. Because God states in Exodus 9:16, he says, but for this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. And this highlights a big difference between, I think, the Hebrew and the Egyptian views. Is this sea crossing, this is the crux, was it a true sea, deep sea, that was parted in a way that only God's power could explain, or was it a shallow marsh that inexplicably the water was drained overnight and in the morning it was dry so they could cross? Was it clearly something God did? This verse seems to be saying, this is something I'm doing to show you my power, to be remembered. And indeed, this event has been remembered for the last 3,500 years. And we know every country that they ran into afterward, for example, Rahab at Jericho, later the Gibeonites, they talk about their hearts melting when they heard what God had done. And so the narrative seems to be suggesting this was an impressive event that only God could do, that was capable of destroying the whole Egyptian army, that caused fear in the surrounding nations, that was described as deep and mighty, and that God was doing for his glory, for the very stated purpose, to be to show off God's power. And that, to me, seems to favor a deep water crossing that could only be explained by God's power, and to really call into question a shallow marsh lake being parted. But there's one other reason I think that a deep water crossing for the sea crossing of the Exodus is the best explanation from what we read in the Bible. And it's another theological reason, beyond just the stated purpose that God was doing this to show off his power and glory. And that is the judgments in the Exodus connected to the judgments in the book of Revelation in the last days. So what I'm seeing is this strong connection is an indicator that the Exodus was actually a precursor or a picture of the judgment in the last days. And so to downplay it or to diminish it is to really get into the area of diminishing or downplaying the judgment at the end of days. So that's the thinking here. So how closely connected are there? We see imagery from the Exodus repeated many times in the book of Revelation. For example, on this side we have the Exodus, and on this side we have the book of Revelation. And the Exodus talks about the great acts of judgment that took place. And here we have water turning to blood in the Exodus, and we have water turning to blood in Revelation. We have frogs in Exodus. We have frogs in Revelation. We have gnats and flies in Exodus, and in Revelation we have pestilence and wild beasts. And it's interesting, in the Jewish tradition, the fourth plague is actually not flies, it's actually wild beasts, is their thinking. And livestock being killed in Exodus, and we have famine in Revelation, and those two seem to be connected. We have boils breaking out into sores in Exodus. We have painful sores in the book of Revelation. We have very heavy hail and fire running down to the earth in Exodus. We have lightning and great hailstones in the book of Revelation. We have locusts in Exodus. We have locusts in Revelation. We have darkness, a darkness that could be felt in Exodus. We have the kingdom being plunged into darkness in Revelation. We have every firstborn dying in Exodus, and we have 4 angels who are released to kill a third of mankind in Revelation. And so this last line about the killing of a third of mankind and the death of the firstborn, the book of Psalms actually talking about this death of the firstborn says this in Psalm 78. It says, "He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels." So there you get an idea of the scale and the immensity of the judgment poured out on Egypt. And also notice that some of these Revelation plagues are only done to those with the mark of the beast. And so we know in Exodus, only the Egyptians were affected in many of these plagues. And it's the same again in the book of Revelation, again establishing this connection. What about the sea crossing and Pharaoh? We're actually going to see Pharaoh connected to the devil in a very clear way, to the dragon, to the serpent. Did Pharaoh actually die in the sea crossing? Because we know in the book of Revelation, in the end, Satan is thrown into the lake of fire. Well, here we have in the Exodus, Pharaoh being thrown into the lake, so to speak, into the sea. And many scholars will say, well, no, Pharaoh was not destroyed in the sea crossing. And you see Hollywood movies with, Ramses there on the shore of the sea, surviving the sea crossing. But I think the Bible is clearly indicating, and in one place explicitly saying, that Pharaoh did die in the sea. Another side point is that after the sea crossing, Moses said, "Don't be afraid, because everyone you see, all these Egyptians you'll never see again. They're going to die." And of course, if Pharaoh had survived, that was the one they were most afraid of. That wouldn't have fit that idea. We see Pharaoh took the army with him. He was leading the army. And then it says in Exodus that all of the Egyptians who went into the midst of the sea were all of Pharaoh's chariots and horses and horsemen. So all went in, and then again at the end, after they were destroyed, none of them survived. So Pharaoh is personally leading the army. They all went in. None of them survived. Okay, then we have this verse. God says, "I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh and all his army." And then again it repeats, "when I have received glory through Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen." So here there's no indication of any kind of different judgment for the army than from Pharaoh. Like one is destroyed and the other just feels bad or something. They're lumped together here in the judgment that's about to happen. And there's more verses than this that talk about God is going to get glory over Pharaoh and his army. And then I think the kicker is what is given in Psalm 136. In Exodus 14, it says, "The Lord threw them," that's the army, "into the sea." And the word that's used there is na'ar, the Hebrew word. And so in the book of Psalms, it says, in Psalm 136, it says, "But he, God, hurled Pharaoh and his army into the sea." And the word that's used there is also na'ar. So some will say, well, this na'ar just means shook off. It just means Pharaoh was shook off. It doesn't mean he was destroyed. But whatever happened to the army is what happened to Pharaoh. It's the same thing. And not only that, it's the same word used back here in the book of Exodus for what happened to the army. And I don't think that's a mistake, because this word na'ar, or shook off in Hebrew, it occurs in only 9 verses in the whole Bible. So it's not like this was a very common word. And the fact that the writer in Psalms uses that very word that's used in Exodus for what happened to the army seems to me to be very intentional, to say what happened to Pharaoh and what is exactly the same thing that happened to his army, and that means he was destroyed. And we read in the book of Ezekiel that Pharaoh is called the great dragon, Ezekiel 29. And then in the book of Revelation, it says, he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And then later, the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur. So again, we have this connection between Pharaoh and Satan. And we see here then Pharaoh is a type or a shadow of a Satan-like figure. And that goes all the way back to the garden, where the serpent was in the garden. And we see these types and shadows all through the Bible, ending with the serpent and the dragon being thrown into the lake of fire. So the judgments of Exodus are, like I said, a precursor. It's almost like Noah and the flood. It's also a precursor to the final judgment. And so to diminish or downplay these judgments and to say that it was just a shallow crossing through a small little lake on the border of Egypt, not many Israelites involved, not much distance crossed, all these things are diminished and downplayed. That seems to be, almost, when it's done for God's glory, it seems to be diminishing God's glory, perhaps, in that effect. So, to conclude, wait, I'm on this one. Okay, to conclude, this aspect of God's glory, I think, and these judgments being connected, that for these particular events of the Exodus, when they're ignored or downplayed by the Egyptian toponym approach, they will oftentimes claim that, oh no, we believe in these being great and grand events, and they are showing off the glory of God. But to do that, at the same time, they're saying that it was small numbers, small distances, short travel times, shallow depths, naturalistic explanations for the sea, and other limiting factors. It just doesn't seem to jibe. Oh, excuse me. And those in the Egyptian view often chafe at the idea that, well, you need a big miracle to make it a big God somehow. But when considering a deep water crossing, it's not so much that which miracle makes a bigger God. It's more which miracle displays the bigness and glory of God and the purpose that God stated, in line with what the text is describing. One's view of the Exodus affects your understanding of how God worked in the past, how he will work in the future, and how he can work today. And it affects our understanding of how he works, I should say. And so to me, it's a view that is worth considering, this Aqaba option, a deep water option. And the Hebrew narrative approach is something that I think deserves more attention, and we're going to give that more attention as we go forward. If you have any questions you want to send me, you can send them to our website at patternsofevidence.com. On our website, you can sign up for Thinker Updates. They're free. They're weekly, usually updates of the latest in biblical archaeology news and commentary. We have an online store where you can buy films, we have books, we have curriculum. You can get more information there as well. So with that, we conclude our talk on the Sea of the Exodus. I hope you've learned something, and have a good day. Thank you.